Africa Week has come and gone, or rather Africa Month, but many fights will continue. For example, to open up borders in Africa to allow freer trade, which will give access to many entrepreneurs and businesses huge markets. This week, Terryanne Chebet was talking about all things trade. She is patron for the Pan-African Business Women's Association in South Africa. She joins us now. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us, Ms. Chebet. Now, tell us about Pan-African Business Women's Association and why the Continental Free Trade Agreement will be such a boost for women in business specifically.
Thank you very much for having me. And more than anything, I think it's quite an exciting time to be an African. You know, with the 54 heads of state ratifying the Free Continental Agreement, trade agreement, definitely means so much for the continent. You know, for years, and you know, we have all said Africa trades more with other continents than it does with itself. But it's time now to really break down the borders, and they have been porous for a long time, so to speak. We've had informal trade, you know, across with all the neighbors of each country in Africa for a long time. But for the first time, Africa can now actually really break down those trade barriers and allow us to trade with ourselves. You know, there's markets for produce that different African countries produce within Africa, but we're focused so much for a long time taking our products to other countries, yet we have such large markets in Africa. So it is the formation of PABWA, the Pan-African Business Women Association, is basically formed around the trade agreement, and we're asking the questions, what can we do so that women are not left behind? And just following the different pillars of the PABWA, I fall under the media pillar, which basically we're saying, can we use the power of storytelling to ensure that women's stories are told, and not only that, but they then inspire the other women who are mostly in that small informal place to begin to formalize their businesses and take advantage of one large, free Africa, so to speak. And it might sound, you know, a little bit like a dream, but it already started in small ways across, say, Kenya, Uganda, South Africa, and Zimbabwe, or one of the other neighbors to the African countries. But we're saying there's so much more in the formal trade space. How can we as women take leadership in the places of influence where we are in, say, media, say, policy, and all these other spaces, and to say, myself as Terryanne, as a media practitioner, how can I elevate the stories of women entrepreneurs so that they can also find out what's happening across Africa and where they can sell, for instance, avocados or leather bags.
Let's talk about the supply chain structures. Do they already exist at an advanced level that if we were to start implementing the free trade agreement now, that it wouldn't be such a struggle?
No, it will be an absolute struggle from the beginning. I mean, and which is unfortunate because the current supply chain infrastructure really favors, countries outside of Africa. Let's look at China and Kenya, for instance, or China and Nigeria, or China and South Africa. And it's everything from the payment platforms to the ease of communication between a seller in China and a buyer in Africa. And we will have now, as Africa, to build those supply chains. Payment platforms, for instance, just ease of communication. It's easier for me as a businesswoman in Kenya to reach out and find somebody selling bottles or plastic bottles in China than it would be for me to find bottles in South Africa or the neighboring country, Uganda, for instance. So it is a time for Africa to just hit the reset button and say, how can we really trade together? So it'll not be easy from the beginning, but it's also a chance for us to really look back and say what infrastructure must be built. It will be cheaper, in terms of freight. If I'm flying something from South Africa to Kenya, it must be cheaper than flying something from China to Kenya. So, it will take a lot of planning. It will take a lot of policy reforms. It will take a lot of new infrastructure to be put in place for us to be actually able to begin to trade with each other.
Now, we know COVID-19 has reversed some of the gains that we would have or have made. Let's talk about the approach that many governments are taking. I know in Kenya, for instance, there was a complaint that it's certainly disadvantaging the poor, the working class are not being properly considered. How do we have a more gendered approach with this issue?
And it's you know, when it comes to matters trade, women are affected more than anyone else, and we've seen the impact of COVID-19 from a gender lens. And it is women who are now, you know, working a lot more than they should because they have children to feed. It's more women than men who are in the informal sector. So then the issue of social safety nets, you know, must come into place. We have seen a number of countries come in with, you know, some sort of funds or incentives uh, geared specifically to the small and micro sector, not specifically for women, but given that a lot of women are already in that informal space, then they will get to benefit from some of the investments and the incentives that have been put in place at this time. So, you know, with COVID-19, I think it's also a time for Africa to really look at, because anything else can happen tomorrow. So it's time for Africa to build the necessary gabions, the necessary safety nets, so that if something else happens next year or 10 years or 50 years down the line, then we will have built the shock absorbers for especially women in trade to be able to deal. In Kenya, for instance, the largest challenge has been, you know, we have a really large informal sector. 70% of Kenyans who are employed today are actually employed in the informal sector. So it's a daily wage, most of whom have not been able to work for a very, very long time. And, you know, we drive down the streets, and I remember having a conversation just this week on, you know, this ladies and young men who are selling things, you know, in traffic. It could be a pack of bananas or green peas or something, but now because of COVID, everybody's sort of, you know, holding back and you can't buy something in traffic. But then there's so much that the government could do in that case. Why not set up a small structure somewhere that is clean, accessible for all these people to be able to sell their wares from there? So there's a lot for us to learn. There's a lot for African governments to learn, but there's also some very quick solutions that can be done to ensure that the people who are living on a daily wage cannot be left out of this, because, you know, we can't slip back into poverty just because of one pandemic that, yes, has hit the whole world. But you know what they say, if the world coughs, then Africa is fainting, so to speak. So it's a time to really rethink how Africa works and how we cushion the poor of the poor, the bottom of the pyramid, so to speak.
Terryanne, thank you very much for your time. Terryanne Chebet from the Pan-African Business Women's Association in South Africa.